Do you need the iPad? Is this going to be too loud? Oh, we're live. All right, well, thank you all for coming to our panel today on how to vaccinate yourself against media bias. As those of you who found the event through Facebook may have seen, it's a very controversial and problematic title, but I think it's an important topic. And to discuss that topic, we have Don Watkins, all the way from the US. Don is co-host of, co-writer, co-author of several books with Yaron Brook, including Equal Isn't Fair and Free Market Revolution. And he is the author of the novel I Am Justice, which comes out on November 10th. Dominique Samuels is a conservative political commentator and a regular on GB News. And Inaya Folarin Iman is also a regular on GB News and a commentator and a presenter and the founder of the Equiano Project and the first ever guest on the Daily Objective, which is a great honor. So please join me in welcoming our panel. And yeah, we will have a Q&A afterwards, so anybody in the audience who has questions, including the YouTube audience, we will take super chat questions. So yeah, Don.
All right, thanks for everybody for showing up. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions about sort of the state of media and what's going right and what's going wrong. And I think there's a lot that we could probably delve into there. But I think about it much more as an individual who's trying to gain knowledge about the world and guide my life. What do I do in the face of the fact that I'm not getting overwhelmed with objective journalism all of the time? And I think that we typically think about media bias in terms of the media distorting and mispresenting what we think is true. But I actually think as an individual striving for knowledge, the biggest problem that we face is actually media bias in favor of our worldview and in favor of our values. And so when I think about what's the biggest problem that I as an individual have to deal with, it's how do I inoculate myself against believing falsehoods that are very convenient for me to believe. So for example, I'm a big free market person. I have a generally positive view of business. And so whenever I hear about kind of like, oh, big business did this awful thing or engaged in this fraud or engaged in some bad practice, I know that my bias is to be very skeptical of it. But Richard Feynman had this great line that's something like the first principle is not to fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And so I have to be very aware that my bias is going to probably lead me, if I'm not careful, to be skeptical or to dismiss claims that actually have grounding, whether it's a business that actually did engage in fraud or some bad practice. And so I think of it as there's really two big things that we can do on our own to protect ourselves against our own desire to kind of feed our biases. And so one is just the thought experiment of whenever I encounter a story that I want to be true in some way, to think, well, what if I didn't want this to be true? So for example, I think that the minimum wage is really nefarious and destructive. And so if I read a story about a study that says, hey, guess what? They hiked the minimum wage in such and such an area and it created unemployment, well, I'm very likely to want to believe that. But then I ask myself, well, what if it reached the opposite conclusion, right? If they said, hey, there's a paper that showed that actually unemployment didn't increase, well, then I'd probably go and read that paper and look with a very fine-tooth comb to pick out all of the inevitable flaws. Well, that's great, that's wonderful, but that's what I should do if the story is supportive of my view. So it's treating even things that we want to believe with the same level of cognitive demands as things that we want to believe or don't want to believe. And then the second is, I think, much more, it's curating your own personal news journey such that you're exposed to a range of views. And it's shocking to me how few people do this. So like, you know, my parents are conservatives, and like 98% of their media consumption comes from Fox News. Well, that's really bad because you're only getting kind of a selective opinion. And so the way that I actually consume media is via Twitter, and it's, I want a range of the best journalists and the best commentators across a range of issues. So different political viewpoints, or if it's something like about nutrition, different theories on nutrition. And so it's forcing myself to encounter the best of ideas and the arguments among ideas. And so if you do those two things, you're, I think, in a much better position to inoculate yourself and protect yourself from the biggest danger in consuming media, which is you. And there's, I think, a lot more to say then about, well, what do you do in the face of attempts to kind of distort and misportray certain issues. But I think if the foundation is holding yourself to a very demanding level of what you'll accept as true, then all of that becomes far easier, rather than let's just sit back and wait till the media becomes perfect, which I think is a kind of fool's errand.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. So I do work in television and have been involved in and around kind of print and television journalism. So I think I will probably just lay out what I think about journalism in the media first. So I suspect this is obviously a group or an event that is very skeptical or critical of the media, but I do think it really does serve a really important function in society, whether that is holding power to account, you know, on an individual level. We can be skeptical of news reports, but ultimately it is the big journalists that are going to be asking questions to the Prime Minister, doing the kinds of exposés and research and investigations that might expose real big wrongdoing. So I do think there is a really important institution there, and it does serve a very important purpose to actually pursue truth and uncover elements of society that we don't necessarily know about or haven't been exposed to. And I think that when it comes to the question of bias, it has been a conversation that has accelerated and gained momentum in the last 10 years or so. And I think part of it is because there are new elements to the problem, but I do think social media has meant that the problem has become much closer. Because at least in the UK, there has always been an element of bias in the media. So there has been this separation between television and print journalism. So print journalism has often been run by the press barons, and we hear about Murdoch and people like that. And we have always known that newspapers like The Sun or The Guardian have their own slant, but they were honest about that. And I think that was what was broadly quite good, that you knew that you were going to be reading a right-wing publication, you knew that you were going to be reading a left-wing one. I think some of the problems with the media now, particularly the television one, is how it often presents itself as impartial, as I think what you were alluding to, but quite clearly has a bias. And we saw that in relation to many key events that were shaping the public conversation, the Trump election and Brexit, where it was clearly ideologically driven, prioritizing and emphasizing stories that had a negative perception and not really being honest about that. And I think that sows a huge level of distrust within society. And I think that one of the other new challenges that I think is the problem is the kind of collapse of a shared value system. So even if there was a left-wing oriented publication or a left-wing oriented journalist, I think that we would be able to rely on the fact that, you know, we have shared values. They believe in democracy, they believe in the pursuit of truth, they believe that there is such a thing as material reality. But now those things are currently into question. You know, we can't even agree on the definition of a woman. We can't even agree on really what the purpose of journalism is. So that sense of a kind of shared value system, regardless of the political spectrum, seems to have fragmented. And another element, and I think this goes back to the Brexit and Trump thing, is the way in which politics has become hyper-personalized. So disagreeing with somebody or having a different view isn't just either a matter of happenstance or just somebody disagreeing because they have a different experience, but it's framed in this very kind of fundamental, existential way. So again, people that support Remain or people that support Brexit, isn't just people that disagree with you. This is a fundamental threat to democracy. This is a kind of existential crisis for society. And so what that often does to journalists is that they don't see their job as just reporting facts. It's the kind of preservation of a particular political coherency or political identity. And that means that their personal views often get very tied into the journalism that they're doing. So I think that the kind of personalization of politics, the kind of collapse of a shared value system, are two really big elements that I think has made the media, particularly television journalism, much more biased. And I think a kind of broader hostility to free speech. And so even if people do have their individual biases, as I think we all do, if you are in an institution that values free speech, that values diversity of opinion, then even if you have a particular news report, you're going to have your colleague essentially saying, well, have you looked at it this way, or have you looked at it that way? And these are some of the breaks in the system to make sure that it is objective. And actually what we have seen is an increasing reduction of the space to which acceptable opinion can be expressed. And so I mentioned Trump at Brexit. We have it with issues to do with race and gender. It's become increasingly narrow. And you also see that in relation to even kind of reporting stories on race, for example. A white person now can't objectively look at that. It's this kind of attack on the idea that our common humanity, that actually, you as a white person aren't able to understand or look objectively at an issue of race. It has to be something, from someone from that particular group. And so all of these things kind of contribute to a sense that people become, their politics is very much involved in the journalism. It's within all these different identity categories, and actually just a kind of dispassionate look at journalism for the perspective of the pursuit of truth becomes increasingly undermined. And then also, I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, the way in which the institution has changed because of the kind of marketization of it. So I think now, unfortunately, journalists there's not enough money in actually doing long-form investigative journalism. That's not where the money's at. Where the money is at for a lot of media organizations is reaction on social media, getting those likes and retweets, having the kind of advertising model the primary driver of it. And so that often incentivizes it to not be kind of long-form, deeply investigative, but things that get a strong reaction and get people talking and following those trends. And so that is a really big element that I think has unfortunately shaped journalism, where it's not just about the pursuit of truth for its own sake, because that's really important, but because, what's going to get all of the reactions. And so, as well in social media, you have all of those incentive structures that I think incentivize for much more reactionary forms of journalism, which to me just simply isn't journalism. So in terms of how one inoculates oneself, I think these problems still exist in the new media. So I think we have seen in the last few years the rise in YouTubers, we've seen the rise in Substack, and I think all of those things are really great. But I do think that there are elements of an institutional journalism that actually prevent, mitigate against some of the problems of the new media. So, for example, people in the new media, people on Substack, they still have to make money. And so if they write an article that their subscribers don't really like and doesn't get any traction, then they're less incentivized to do that. They don't have the editorial oversight that you might have from an editor, from your colleagues. They're doing it very independent. So I think that there is a danger in when we criticize the mainstream media or the legacy media, is to assume that alternative media are free from some of the problems that journalism can be facing. So yes, whilst I do think on an individual level we can look at a range of sources, we can listen to a range of views. I do think as citizens of a society, we do have a responsibility to respond to the problems of trust within institutions, and that means holding institutions to a higher level of expectation, because I think that those are really important for a functioning democracy. And I think that when we hyper-individualize it, I think there is often a danger that it can, when it becomes too individualized, it does breed conspiracy theories when people are so distrustful that they don't really feel like there's anything in the media that they can trust, and they often look at more and more fringe or unreliable sources. So I think that for all of us, the best way to inoculate ourselves is to actually hold the media to account and see it as an institution that is essential to our democracy, and therefore expect more from it. And I think when we support, fund, and incentivize genuinely good journalism, then the institution then changes because it's responding to what us as people want. And so whilst there are things that we can do in the present in order to mitigate against the problems of media bias, I think ultimately we want to orient the media in a way that is much more rigorous and journalistic. I don't necessarily think that's an individual solution, but I think it's a much more kind of a collaborative response as citizens to hold the media to higher expectations and incentivize for much better journalism.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm going to be a bit more controversial, as usual. I don't do it on purpose, and I think I'm going to come from a particular standpoint that says, in terms of media bias, I believe that this bias only seems to be coming from one direction, in more of a cultural, influential sense. So during the 2016 presidential election and during the run-up to the Brexit referendum, the term fake news, first uttered by Trump during the election, has become part of our kind of daily colloquial vocabulary, and this is used by both the left and the right. But I think in the case of Trump, I don't think that this charge that was leveled at the media in terms of them pumping out fake news was entirely unfair, in my opinion. Although, the United Kingdom has far more stringent rules in comparison to America in terms of impartiality, I do think that in terms of the way certain events were presented, there seemed to be a very particular slant. And with reference to the presidential election, I think the most interesting part about that was the fact that everybody assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. There were various forecasters that said that she was going to win, I think, by 90% or greater in terms of probability. And then when it actually came to the election result, you could see that that just didn't happen. And I think the issue with that is that it cultivates sort of a mistrust within the general populace, because I think if, those at CNN or, other parts such as Washington Post had bothered to actually speak to Trump voters, they would have understood that he actually had a groundswell of support, whether it be Latino voters, African-American voters, women, black people, and that was even more prevalent in the last election against Joe Biden. So I think that that's an issue. And with reference to what's going on here, during the 2016 Brexit referendum, we saw a similar trend, whereby it was greatly assumed by the media that Remain was going to win. Various forecasters said that this was going to happen. One poll actually put Remain 52-48, which is funny because the opposite happened. And analysis of the BBC's output actually found that it did have a negative slant towards Brexit. So we're regularly told that this bias doesn't exist, but it quite simply does. And I've even had my experience with this personally, so I'll tell a bit of a story. I was rung up by Good Morning Britain to do a debate on whether or not you should unfriend unvaccinated friends. And I was sat there absolutely incredulous, because I was thinking that, this kind of conversation, it's incredibly divisive, it's just not needed. And when I was actually doing the debate with Adil Ray, who was the Good Morning presenter, I said that obviously I don't think it's right, because I'm a believer in individual liberty, and I don't think that uppity, snobby moral standards should dictate your friendships. But what was curious about this is, after the debate, there were loads of people that were in support of what I was saying. Yet when I looked online and I was sent articles, there were various articles that were saying that I was against the COVID jab, which is fine if you perceive what I said to be that, but that's not what I said. What I said was that the COVID vaccine is actually working for the vulnerable, so therefore unfriending unvaccinated friends is completely ridiculous. But there were two such articles that were just blatantly untrue, and these were by The Sun and the Daily Mirror, and they referred to me as an anti-vaxxer, and we know in today's world, that is a very, very powerful term that has the power to ruin people's lives. And it was quite simply libelous. Luckily, when I actually contacted The Sun, they removed the article altogether because it was quite frankly wrong. And the Daily Mirror had to update the article and remove the anti-vaxxer label. But I think what that shows you is that, you know, media outlets have great power at the moment, and this power is particularly on one side of the political aisle. It's on the left side of the political aisle, and it's very dangerous to be constantly pumping out one side of the debate. And that's why I feel as though debate right now and politics right now is so polarized, because people feel as though there's only one side of the debate that they're being given. So I think quite controversially in terms of how you inoculate yourself against media bias, I think we're already at a moment right now where we need to stop pretending that media is impartial, because I just don't think it is. In America, you have alternatives such as Fox News where you can actually go and see, because on a daily basis, the platitudes of CNN are pumped out everywhere. People can view it quite easily. But I feel like in this country, we don't necessarily have that alternative, which is why a lot of people have such a dogmatic view of the way politics is, whether it's lockdowns and coronavirus, whether it's race. For example, the BBC described a protest in London as largely peaceful, despite the fact that 27 officers were injured, and then had to change the headline. That's just an example of how this bias from, the BBC, which is a state broadcaster, this is an example of how dangerous that can be. So I think it's time to stop pretending that the likes of ITV's Good Morning Britain, the BBC, many of its shows, and the whole of Channel 4's output is impartial. And I think start owning up to that fact. If you are clearly impartial, I think you should be honest about it instead of pretending you're not. And that's why, and it's funny that Inaya is here right now, because that's why I feel as though, the development of GB News is so important, and also Talk Radio. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. Because it allows people to actually go to an avenue and actually perhaps see the other side of the debate that they don't regularly see. And although charges of bias can be leveled against that as well, it's still important to have those alternative views shown. But when they're not, that's where people get angry. So I think there is an opportunity here in terms of being honest about our views and the views of journalists, and being able to present them quite clearly so people can get a balanced view of things. And I think that, I don't necessarily believe that sort of a Fox News style channel in the UK here is necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's something that, the panelists might disagree with, but I don't think so, because I don't think we have enough honesty. And just lastly, I feel as though in terms of social media, I think there's a really big opportunity for people to develop their own forms of independent media and get the message across to people that way. I think Twitter is a great outlet for that as well. And also, like you said, the YouTubers that we've seen that comment on politics. And I think that although we are in dire straits right now, the development of independent media and outlets like GB News, particularly in this country, are a good thing. And the only way to inoculate yourself against that is to firstly have the outlets there that allow you to see a different point of view, because in this country, we do not have enough of it.
Could I pick up on a few things? I agreed with a lot of what Dominique said. Those two things I wanted to get your opinion on, because I've definitely, obviously I'm a presenter on GB News, obviously I'm not in any hiding about that, but I've been in conflict internally in relation to, so whilst I think the development of GB News is undoubtedly a positive thing in a climate where there is a lack of diversity of opinion, I definitely do think, though, that there is a danger in all of us becoming retreating more and more into echo chambers and our silos. And if there's a kind of left-wing outlet that primarily talks about left-wing issues and has left-wing commentators on, and then you have a more centre-right outlet, where are we actually discussing? And that's, I guess, the question, where are we discussing together? Especially when you have a situation where some people will say, well, I'm not going to go on this platform because it's right-wing, or I'm not going to go on the platform because it's left-wing. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about the notion of a kind of public service broadcast. Like, I know in America they don't have that one, or I mean is it MSNBC? Is that non-biased? Is that neutral?
No.
So they don't have a public service broadcaster where its central purpose is to represent as many views as possible. Yeah, that C-SPAN?
Closest, but they're not really reporting things. They're just gonna like show you like, okay, here's what's happening in Congress right now. Let me.
Yeah, because I'd be interested in what you think.
Well, I just want to connect kind of what I'm talking about to the points that you both made, which I think are really interesting, and that is, so I definitely think there needs to be dramatic improvement at the level of the media, and there's a lot of complexity, as you're pointing out, into what would that even look like, but I think at the fundamental level, if we're demanding something better, that is, we're actually making consumption choices based on, I'm trying to really understand things and not just hear the views I already agree with screamed louder than my opponents, then that starts to create a market incentive to meet that need. But if you actually look at what drives clicks right now, and I mean, you guys have like grown your social media presence, like you probably have a really good antenna for this is gonna get attention. The incentives are all towards not clear thinking and giving us accurate understanding of what's going on in the world. It's much more like this will drive attention, this will drive controversy, this will get people's emotions juiced up, often for tribal reasons. And so I think that it's a hard problem to solve, but the number one thing that any of us can do is hold ourselves to high standards for what we're trying to access. And then that creates a market for really solid journalism because there's people out there actually trying to get to the truth on different issues. So it's not like an immediate silver bullet because, you know, you as one person are not like the most remunerative market, but nevertheless, I think that's the number one thing that we can do in order to start building a basis for a better media system that can actually make money because people will be demanding healthier content.
Yeah, I think I hear those points, but I feel like the issue is that we don't have that rigorous, unbiased journalism right now. We just don't have it. It comes from one side of the political aisle constantly, and even from the BBC. And, you know, trust in the BBC has declined by, I think, 20%, according to the Reuters Institute since 2018. So although it's still very trusted by the British public, and I think that's largely to do with the sort of cultural esteem and preeminence it has in British society, but I think it does clearly show that there is an element of dissatisfaction. And I think that when you have more competitors in a market, such as, say, Talk Radio, The Perspective Talk TV, or even GB News, I feel like when you have more of those competitors, there will inevitably be more of a motivation to have those mainstream media outlets striving for truth. So say, for example, when Nigel Farage went and reported on the migrant boat crisis independently, and he did that from his YouTube, and he did that from Twitter, only then, when he reported on it independently, did the BBC, did ITV then go and actually investigate and do the rigorous journalism that they're supposed to be participating in anyway. So I feel as though it's all well and good to say that we must hold ourselves to higher standards and we must hold the media to higher standards, which we should, but that doesn't always work on an individual level when the people that we have in these established institutions right now quite simply are not interested in that. They're not interested really in truth. They're interested in galvanizing what can generate headlines. And I think that's partly to do with the human condition. I think that as human beings, we are really quite tribal and we do look for things that confirm our own biases. And I think that's something that will always be a part of us as human beings. So I think that's why perhaps I'm a bit pessimistic of this idea that we can just hold our media to account and it will change. Well, no, I don't think that. I think that what people need is those clear alternatives. And, you know, you will find people that go on, you know, right-wing news outlets to just hear their thoughts barked at them constantly. But people like me, for example, I have to watch Sky News, I have to watch the BBC, I have to watch Good Morning Britain to see what's going on. But then I can also go on GB News and hear some of my thoughts and opinions actually reflected. And it's that plurality that I think it's important that we quite simply do not have. And it's always hidden under the guise of impartiality when currently it just doesn't exist.
Just building on that, so I do agree that it's not necessarily a very individual thing, but whilst I agree about having more diversity of media outlets, I think that one of the really interesting things over the last 18 months in the pandemic has been the huge increase in conspiracy theories. And I don't use conspiracy theories in the way that I think a lot of the time that's used, so not in a way that's dismissive, but in the sense that there was this kind of sense of alienation and distrust that rapidly expanded for many understandable reasons. But I think part of the reason was that is because of that we weren't genuinely meeting one another. We weren't genuinely interacting. And so whatever thoughts and ideas we might create and narratives in our head weren't necessarily being mitigated or countered by reality itself. And I think part of the problem, I think that's where this whole phrase, the metropolitan liberal elite, came from, which is the idea that many people in the established media industry come from a similar background, live in the same areas, very much know each other, and aren't going out and experiencing, what it's like to live in Hartlepool, what it's like to live in Manchester, what it's like to live in Northern Ireland. And, I almost never hear stories about Northern Ireland, which is a part of the country that's often experiencing a lot of conflict and violence. And so I do think that part of it is, yes, having more diversity in the media world, but I think we need to rebuild the public square. I think that we need to rebuild the spaces in real life where you actually come into contact with people that are different to you, whether that is universities, whether that is, the pubs. These are places where you find people that are different to you, that have different views and experiences, and then you have a much more vibrant democracy. This is what I was saying earlier about the media being an institution within a wider kind of democratic ecosystem. And I think that when we have a situation where there is this huge separation, where we're kind of all in our homes, in retreat and distrustful, yes, we can do things on an individual level, but I think that there are kind of fundamental ecosystems within our society that are missing, that mean that we interact with one another and not just retreat into our echo chambers. So I don't think it's solely about diversity of media organization. I think we do need to have those spaces where we communicate and interact across divides as well.
So one point that I think helps kind of bring a deeper perspective in what you just said is, like, what is even the media's job? Because it's often put in these kind of like, we're trying to create a certain kind of democracy, or, but really what their job is to report facts. And facts are basically what qualifies as a fact in terms of the media is something that can't be disputed. Now, that you have to be precise about this, because people can interpret things, but let's say a study comes out that says, drinking water is the #1 leading cause of death. The media can report this report came out, and they can also report expert opinion, that most experts think that this report is completely crazy. And so you'd think, well, that doesn't seem like it should be that hard. If what the media is doing is reporting kind of concrete facts that are beyond dispute, then there doesn't seem, it's not obvious why there's so much room for bias. But so much of it is they have to select which facts are worthy of consideration. That is, they have to make a determination of importance. And that is where, if you are kind of embedded in a subculture that views, let's call it a very left-wing or very right-wing subculture, your view of what's important, like in the United States, were Hillary's emails on the server important? Was Trump, I don't even want to repeat some of the comments, like, were those comments important? Those are all kind of judgments, and the more that you have a kind of diversity in journalism, the more that you'll get a diversity of judgments of what's important, and so more of the stuff that is crucial to our understanding decision-making gets brought to the surface. And I think the big problem that you have in bias is not the fact that journalists can be biased, it's that it does tend to be either one way, or at least what happens, like in the United States, is you get kind of the balkanization of the media, and then people only feed on one type of media. So even if there's kind of a multiplicity of different viewpoints that are represented, they're represented in these kind of isolated silos, and people only feed off of a trough that is conducive to what they want to hear. And so it has the same result as if you had a monopoly viewpoint, with the one benefit that for those of us who are going to be kind of like intellectually entrepreneurial and try to expose ourselves to more viewpoints, at least we can do that. So it sounds like one of the challenges in the UK is like that's a lot harder to do than it is in the United States. Like you as an individual, you know, there's only like the BBC and maybe some independent journalists, and so it's a lot harder as a consumer, even if you want to hold yourself to higher standard, to really figure out what's going on. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, we do have, you know, Channel 4 is regarded as slightly, you know, centre-left. ITV, you know, so we do have a bit, but then, yeah, so I would agree with you, but the BBC overwhelmingly, you know, 70% of audiences are watching the BBC.
Yeah, I think that's kind of my point about having kind of a diversity of media outlets that the consumer can go and look at. And I think previously we just haven't had that. So I think my issue is more so to do with the fact that Channel 4 clearly has a left-wing political slant. I'd say ITV is more centre-left. And I think the BBC is, it would say it's in the centre, but I think it's centre-left as well. And I think the issue with the bias is when it actually creates social phenomena that can be counterproductive to our political system and our political processes. So recently, there was a reported fuel crisis, and this is to do with the after effects of there being a shortage of HGV drivers that can deliver fuel, supplies, food, etc., etc. But what was funny about this is this fuel crisis was reported by the media initially, and then it was pumped out by all of our mainstream media outlets, and that actually led to panic buying. So loads of people were going to their petrol stations, getting loads and loads of petrol. People were fighting. There were even TikTok videos. Someone was riding on a horse, videoing themselves, mocking the people at the petrol station. It was very, very bizarre. But what conveniently came out after all this had happened is that the result of this so-called fuel crisis was not that there was a shortage of fuel necessarily, but that people were panic buying. And what led to people panic buying was the media constantly saying there was a crisis when there wasn't necessarily a crisis at all. And I think this is my frustration, because we can talk about diversity in the media all we want, but when there isn't currently that diversity there, it can be unfair. And I think that's why people do look to confirm their biases a lot. And I think, you know, not to be patronizing, but in sort of these intellectual spaces, I think it's very easy to say that we should delve deep and question ourselves, because that's what people that are generally quite politically engaged, probably university educated, well educated, tend to do. But I think the average person does look directly at what they do look directly at what can be simplified for them to be able to easily understand. And I think that, you know, when you perhaps have a news outlet that's coming from a political position that can verbalize that in a simple way, that can help the average everyday person. And I think that's partly why there's been such a large appetite for GB News. But I will say, I won't present GB News as this completely biased TV channel. I think it does have a political slant, but I feel as though it does have a multiplicity of opinions. I have them on the panel that I'm on every Thursday. You see them on, you know, the breakfast TV shows, the daily TV show. So I don't think my argument is that you can't ever have anyone with a, you know, a difference of opinion. My central point, we interact and, you know, be in more public forums together, because the average person right now is just kind of worried about how they can put food on the table. So not to be pessimistic, but how does it get better from here would be my, you know, kind of thought out there.
There's a point that you made that I think was really important in relation to part of the problem is when media bias end up shaping real-world social events. And I think that that there were BBC Three, which is another part of the BBC that I genuinely love, but they were some of the discussions they've been having about what their new output was going to be in relation to young people, because it primarily focuses on young people, is they said it was going to focus on issues to do with gender, race, and identity. And I knew instantly that that wasn't going to be, you know, black conservatives or transgender people that believe, you know, biological sex is real. I knew that the people that they were going to be having to represent those views were from a very specific ideological perspective, and those views absolutely should be represented, but also to unravel and reveal the different layers of the conversation. And actually, for a young person who might be thinking about those issues or questioning them, they go to, you know, BBC Three or what have you and find out what other young people think. And then if they look at that and think that's what really they're meant to think, and then that gets reinforced. So I do absolutely agree with you about the fact, the danger is when the narratives end up actually shaping events and warping the way in which we really view the world. And I think it's a really complicated question, you know, as to what to do about that. I think in some way, I think diversity of opinion, as I mentioned, like GB News is the beginning of it. But how we get back to a space where we can all actually discuss in a way that's not, you know, deeply aggressive and polarized, I think that's a broader social and cultural problem that is probably way bigger than the media problem.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, I'll just say quickly because I keep talking. But I think, again, kind of pessimistically, I think that time where we could speak properly as individuals without getting aggressive and without getting personal, I do think it's gone. I think we are at a point of no return, if I'm being honest. You know, maybe I can be positive and say that more conversations like this, you know, happen, if they do happen, and we will get there eventually. But I think the problem is that in terms of sort of left-wing political thought, what's quite powerful about it is that it pervades the cultural. So when you have such cultural preeminence in any society, the political automatically becomes personal. And that's why whenever we have these sorts of discussions, whether it be trans rights, whether it be, you know, vaccines, whether it be left versus right, it gets inevitably quite personal. So perhaps the solution needs to be a seismic cultural change, but it seems that even in the political sphere, from Labour to the Conservatives, there doesn't seem to really be actually that much of that, you know, plurality there in terms of cultural lines, I think, anymore. I think there is a difference, but I suppose that goes back to the whole culture wars thing, which is a completely different conversation altogether.
Yeah, so we'll go to Q&A from the audience, and we have a couple of super chats, but I just had, what would an look like? How can something like that be successful?
So I do think the original mission of the BBC is that. You know, I think that's what it should be. And I don't know if it can be something that ends up being privatized, because I do think if you have a financial incentive, then the orientation is ultimately, you know, your fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. I think that having a publicly funded institution whose goal and central purpose is to represent the views of all people and reflect all areas of the country, and we pay for that because we see it as our civic and social responsibility, I think that that is a really good thing. I think that we were closer to that in the past. That's gone more now. But I do think that ultimately, if 60, 78% of the population no longer see the BBC as something that they trust, then the Director General, the management have to listen to that. I think they have to look at that. And then you start to see more regionality. You start to see more diverse voices. You know, the fact that, you know, the BBC have had you on. The BBC have had me on. So it's not that they're totally shutting out different views. And I think as a society, we have to continue to, you know, critique and raise awareness of that. And I do think that does slowly shift and orient it back to its mission. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but I do think that the BBC should be that.
Yeah, do you know what? Okay, I would agree that. I don't think the BBC is wholly a bad thing, because I have been on the BBC and there are some great people that work there. But I think probably the issue is accountability. I think because the BBC has grown into this bloated monster that overpays many of its presenters that feel the need to broadcast their political views online, there doesn't seem to be really that accountability there, and I think that's really important. So maybe some sort of new independent body should be set up, perhaps by the government, tasked with holding the BBC to account, perhaps independently surveying its finances, the way it manages its money, but also perhaps its recruitment process, which may be a bit controversial I don't know. I think what you said about regionality, though, is very, very important, because in terms of the BBC's hiring practices, they talk a lot about diversity, but I think that sort of centres around people's skin colour, which I don't really believe is the best sort of diversity. I think what we need is people from more working class backgrounds, people from different parts of the country, because, as you've said, you know, the metropolitan liberal elite and sort of the Westminster bubble and revolving door, that's a real thing. You know, I've been around these people, they do know each other, they do go to each other's houses and have dinner together. It's very, very insular. So it can be a bubble, and that's why they seem to be perpetuating one sort of view. So I think more accountability and more diversity in terms of regional voices, but I think what should probably be stressed is a diversity of political thought. Now, I know that journalists are not supposed to vocalize that, but the reality is they do have political slants. You've seen with a lot of the journalists that they've hired, you go through their Twitter feed and they're obsessed with Jeremy Corbyn. So let's be honest about that, but actually seek out more working class people, perhaps more northern people, but also people that might happen to be conservative, because I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think once you do get that balance, that's when we'll start to be back in a positive place again, because right now it's hell.
So my view is that government cannot play any role in media, because whether it's restricting speech or funding speech, those are both versions of control of speech. And so I think it's monstrous if my money is being used against my will to promote ideas that I disagree with or values that I find reprehensible. And so I think the only solution fundamentally has to be that you have free competition in the realm of journalism. Now, there's a really hard problem that they face right now, which is that, as we talked about earlier, the market does not want objectivity. We live in an enormously tribal time, and that is what the demand is for. People want to have, what people tend to turn to the media for is in order to have their anger or their fear or their moral righteousness echoed in a way that makes them feel good. And if that's really what the market wants, then that's going to, then the media is both a cause but also a consequence of more disturbing trends and longer standing trends that are going on. And so I think that you can't really talk about a healthier media culture absent really taking seriously the direction the culture has gone over the last 40 or 50 years. And I don't think that's fundamentally driven by media, though media has definitely had a role. I think it's ultimately driven by ideas and by philosophic ideas about what it means to be an individual, about the relationship between individuals in the group and individuals in society and individuals in government. And so the things that make the things that are encouraging media to be so bad today, I think have to be addressed as part of a larger conversation about some of the ideas in the culture, including some of the ones about group identity that you've been mentioning that I think are definitely corrosive and part of this whole tribalism. And part of the reason that you don't want government in control of media is because what can happen is a relatively minority viewpoint, say, some of the ideas about gender, like there is, no biological sex or something like that. When an intellectual vanguard runs the media, which is the way that things are now, a tiny minority viewpoint can suddenly have enormous influence and power that it wouldn't be able to win on its own terms. And so that's one of the reasons why you just don't want to create that scenario where basically, like, I go to work and then my money is going to fuel toxic ideas that wouldn't be able to win if they had to win in a fair and square battle. So that's how I think about the issue.
We do see that intellectual vanguard also in the corporate world. So I don't think it's solely something that infects publicly funded institutions.
No, definitely not. So the point is not like all public institutions are awful and all private institutions are good, but rather I only deal with a private institution when I decide that I agree to the terms of the agreement, right? So if I think like Apple is really awful, like, well, I just won't buy an iPhone. Whereas if I think the BBC is awful, that I'm in a much different situation. So that's how I think about it. It's not that one is inherently good and one is inherently bad. It's that one I have the ability to opt out of and the other I don't.
But there is one quick super chat from Mary Aline. Did Don say Twitter is a good news source?
Twitter can be it's the best of worlds and the worst of worlds. It's what you make of it. Like, that's the power of it, is that you get to curate the information diet you engage in a really specific way. That is, you get to kind of choose the conversations that you're going to be a party to. And so if you do it thoughtfully, I think it's the best way to consume news. If you don't do it thoughtfully, then it's you're going to find the same problems on any other kind of social media or media platform. But I mean, this is true almost of every form of social media. I just think Twitter's the most intellectual and has the highest upside in terms of intellectual nourishment. But you have to hunt for that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the truth is that only 20% of the country, or at least in the UK country, use Twitter. And so I think that, it's limited in relation to who's on it. And also, I do, and again, I might be a minority on this panel, but I do really like the idea of something that really speaks to the country. And so not just speaks to you and your kind of silo and something that you've created, but speaks to the country as a citizen. And so, if the Prime Minister announces that, Britain's going to war, we all hear that at the same time and we're all reacting to that. And that's a very kind of compelling and cohesive sense of community that I don't necessarily think that you get in the same way on social media platforms. I definitely think that you have internet subcultures, but one of the things I think has been quite interesting is the way in which these kind of internet subcultures really have a really high moment and then kind of collapse. So we saw that with the kind of new atheists, and it really grabbed a lot of people, and it kind of just filtered out. And a similar thing with the kind of so-called intellectual dark web. It was a really big moment with all of those different figures, and it kind of filtered out. But there's a kind of sense of continuity with, I think, a lot of the established media, and a continuity that should, in principle, speak to all of us. And so that's why I would still defend it against saying that necessarily social media is a better way to consume news.
Yeah, I think I generally agree. I'm not going to knock Twitter because Twitter's, how I'm doing what I'm doing essentially, which I think it's great. I think it's a great public platform, but I do think it runs the risk of creating those echo chambers that are not entirely conducive. And, there is this sort of running joke that if it's popular on Twitter, it's probably not popular, around in the country, which I think is true. As you said, a minority of people are actually on Twitter. So I agree with you in terms of, I think you should use it thoughtfully, follow the BBC, follow different platforms to actually get that breaking news, and also have that diet of personal opinion and people putting that stuff out there. I think a healthy mix of the two is great, but just in general, in terms of the internet, I think the internet is great, particularly because it's least able to be controlled. You do see technological giants gaining more of that power in terms of politics, being able to influence the way things like that happen. But I think a great thing about the internet is that it cannot really be controlled. Government can't really control it. It's free. And that's what I think is very, very beneficial about it. But shouldn't be the only thing that people access. Like you said, there should be something that speaks to everyone. Trouble is, there isn't, but there you go.
Hello? Oh, that's a lot louder than I thought. I was thinking of the title this evening, Vaccinate Yourself Against the Media. And just as a disclaimer, I did that, a little drastic, by giving up television and newspapers about 16 years ago. got rid of my TV license. And also we have an interesting area of competition in the marketplace with the internet. And I'm seeing something, it's too soon to say this is a trend, but I'd be interesting to push for your views on this. A couple of days ago, I hope I don't badger her name, Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks and Ben Shapiro took the form of a debate together, but it was very civil, very nice. And it struck me, and they did this with intention. Let's say politically, you know, two different sides, but it seemed to be what they were saying there, and I'm hoping it certainly could be a trend. I don't think it is yet, as I'd be interested to know your views. With it 2 days ago, this went up, and it's already around 800,000 views, which is, I think, pretty good given today's broadcast figures. By the way, years ago, I worked with the BBC as well. I think that there's definitely a marketplace audience for people who are fed up with heated debates, people shouting over each other. And throughout journalism, it's not recently, destruction and envy sells. And the fiduciary responsibility to shareholders is exactly, you've got to have profits. But there is a marketplace out there, and it's an interesting time because we do have the internet and we do have competition there. And 2 days, 800,000 views is not bad, and it'll grow. And there are people presenting something there which is not so divisive. So presenting it that way, it's formed more of a sort of a comment just to push your views on that. And I'm hoping to push you towards having something a little more positive to think about in the future. And I actually am looking at you when I say that, and just to get your views. So there, I've laid it out. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that's why I kind of think that independent YouTubers and platforms like that are actually so amazing, because one of the ways that I came to find what my political views were, funnily enough, were actually viewing these YouTube channels, and they were predominantly American. I was watching Ben Shapiro, I was watching the Rubin Report, which I think you were on. Yeah, the Rubin Report, I think that's absolutely great, and that really is centered around conversations. I like Joe Rogan as well, and I watched something from quite a while ago that was between Russell Brand, who is very, very left-wing, and he was having a conversation with Candace Owens, of all people. And yeah, she's great, but the conversation that they had was just so civil. So I do agree with you, and that's why I do feel as though the internet is one of those places where there's just untold potential. So it's not all bad. Thank you for that.
I'm trying to decide whether to tell my Russell Brand story. I'll set that to the side, but I did an event with him, and it was, he's a very interesting guy. But the wider point about, I do think that there is look, one of the coolest breakthroughs we've had in the last 5 years is the discovery that there's a market for long-form content that delves seriously into ideas and that isn't about shouting each other. And I have a lot of problems with what happened with the intellectual dark web. I think they basically kind of self-destructed because they became so obsessed with patting themselves on the back for how amazing we are for sitting around having debates, but they never debated anybody except for the handful among them who all agreed on kind of the core issues that they talked about. But it was still proof that people were interested in ideas, open to hearing controversial ideas. And I do think that I can't watch debates because they just fill me with so much anxiety, but that is, like, I think we are seeing more of that, and that's part of the amazing thing that the internet makes possible, is that, like, you know, you can put something like that on that gets 800,000 views and finds its market. And so I think it's really exciting that people are starting to appeal to that. I don't know what it can grow into and evolve into. I think part of what both of you have stressed in various ways is that we need to be concerned with the media as an institution, and that these things can't exactly replace it, but they're certainly, I think, valuable and beneficial, and we should be happy that they're there, even if at the end of the day, you still want these kind of central institutions that we can look at, that have the funding and long-term vision to do real investigative work, to be able to stand up and give a voice to people who are going up against big institutions that have deep pockets and a lot of power. So there's unique roles that media, as we've traditionally thought about it, I think is important for, and that can't be cured by these alternatives, but these alternatives are amazing and really enhance our ability to understand the world. And so I'm very positive and bullish on that.
Have been on YouTube and everything like that, but again, they're not news. You know, they're long-form intellectual discussion, which is really insightful and compelling, and but they're not news, and they do rely on people actually going out and doing the journalism. Oh, brilliant! Yeah, so I think, echoing what you'd say, I think these things are great, but they can't replace going out and doing the rigorous journalistic work that they rely on to substantiate their conversations.
Well, we can use this microphone for questions. Anybody in the audience have a question? Elliot.
Hello, yeah. Okay, so I agreed with Don's points about how there shouldn't be some sort of state media, state-controlled or state-funded media. But I think in terms of the points that you both, in fact, I can't remember who said it. You said something about how 60 or 70% of the nation thinks that the BBC is biased in some way. And I wanted to, in some way, sort of say how a media's a media outlet shouldn't be necessarily controlled by the public perception of them. They need to be able to have, say, a broad, possibly even dislike of said media outlet. Otherwise, it just becomes, say, let's say if it's for one nation's media outlet that is state-controlled or state-funded, it just becomes an echo chamber of that nation. So, for example, in the UK, one topic that is you basically can't even question whether or not it should be around anymore is the NHS. And I think part of that is probably, the BBC has caught on that this is a popular idea and, over and over in the news cycle, it's never questioned, there's a problem with the NHS, maybe we should go to privatization. Instead, it is just an echo chamber within the nation of the NHS is good, but it is being mismanaged, so it needs to be, somewhat changed in this way or that way. So I was thinking, is a nationally popular outlet of news even a good thing? Because, just because something popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good.
Oh, no, I said it's declined by 20%. But, okay, I think it's a bit of a difficult one because I think in terms of the BBC, whether we like what they say or not, we still have to pay the TV license, for example. Taxpayers do have to do that, and if they don't do that, they face legal action, regardless of the kind of output that the BBC puts out there. So I don't necessarily think that is the problem, but I think, again, it goes back to sort of a trickle-down effect culturally within the BBC as an institution, where it is looking towards people that do have a certain worldview. So it's very polarizing in that sense. And I agree with you in terms of the NHS. There's no real wider conversation or really an investigation into the NHS, how it's run, sort of the bureaucracy that exists there. There's no real challenge of that. And I think, again, that goes back to the problem with the BBC. I think it's gotten so comfortable within itself, the fact that the taxpayer funds it, the fact that they're not really accountable and they have massive bloated budgets that they can spend on a multitude of programs that people aren't necessarily tuning into. I think it's that lack of accountability that sort of makes the BBC so untouchable. I'm a bit in between about whether or not the BBC should exist at all, because I definitely think there is a place for it. But I think because it is, you know, the British Broadcasting Corporation, it is insular in that sense, which makes it not really that accountable. So I'm a bit in between.
So I would agree with you in relation to, I don't think it should just regurgitate our views. I think its approach shouldn't be what's popular, even though it should also reflect what's popular sometimes, but the different layers of the debate. So that sometimes could be unpopular. And so I think that, again, if we are thinking from the perspective of what is good journalism, you look at what are the different layers and elements of that particular issue. And then if you're interested in truth, if truth is at the heart of it, then it's not really about what's popular. I mean, if you're going up against power, you know, that can be dangerous, that can potentially be life-threatening for some whistleblowers, but you do it because you are interested in the pursuit of truth. And so I think if that's at the heart of an institution's values in journalism, then they would be able to reflect both what's popular but what's unpopular, but is important to say because it's true. I think that state-funded doesn't necessarily mean state-controlled. So the government at this current time is very critical of the BBC, despite the fact that it's state-funded. So I do think that you can have levels of independence whilst also being state-funded. And this is not me advocating for a big state or anything like that. I'm very critical of government expansion. But in relation to the question of democracy, as I keep going back to, I think it's a vehicle that can have a genuine civic and social responsibility that I think oftentimes private media don't. And we do genuinely see this. And I would love to see, and I would welcome examples, if people do have examples of genuinely impartial, genuinely rigorous television journalism, wherever it is in the world, that doesn't also face these same problems. And so I guess the question is trying to get to the heart of what is this problem that keeps tripling us all up? What is this problem that is, rigidifying the boundaries of acceptable speech, making free speech stifled? I think, as I mentioned before, I think that is a cultural problem of tribalism in the current moment that actually affects all levels of public life.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is that what you're talking about, I wouldn't put as primarily an issue of media. So really the default is that most of things in society are considered settled issues and are untouchable and unquestionable. Like that was what human history was. Like you didn't question the way things were done. And it was really a huge achievement when people started deciding, no, we're actually going to question seemingly settled issues. And so if you think what happened during the Enlightenment is, well, no, we're going to demand like that reasons for religion, reasons for our government institutions. We're going to hold all of that up to the flame of reason. And like that's what's revolutionary, not the fact that we can't question stuff. It's amazing that we reached the point where we have a lot of latitude to question things. But unfortunately, what's started to happen in the last several decades is that that's becoming less and less of life is open to question. And so, you mentioned something like the British healthcare system. We've talked about some of the issues with group identity that now are getting taken off the table, and there's kind of like, these are your permissible opinions. And so in that kind of scenario, the real thing to be terrified about is not exactly like, okay, what exactly is the structure of the media? It's what drives a culture in the direction of respecting people's ability to question everything, even its most kind of like celebrated institutions, and what drives a country away from being able to do that. And I think that ultimately what makes that possible, a society where we can debate everything and question everything, is a real respect for reason and the mind. And I think that's one of the reasons why these group identity ideas are really toxic, is that they teach you that you don't have a mind as an individual, that you're just a passive recipient of your genes or of your class or something like that. And so I think the thing to be concerned about is ideas that are anti-reason and anti-independent thinking. And then media, I think, just in effect reflects that and then accelerates it, right? So it's not the kind of fundamental causal factor, right? Like if you had a better media system, I don't think that by itself would do much to get people to question, government control of healthcare. What you want is the ability to question everything and celebrate questioning everything, and then hopefully a better media system will help better ideas proliferate. But like, it's such a tertiary issue when it comes to why can't we ask hard questions and offer radical alternatives about things that the culture celebrates as true and important and good? It's amazing that we have as much ability to do that as we do, and we should fight for more of it, but there's just no mystery why that's not like the default.
Hiya. Just to look at this with some historical context, if we look back to the advent of printing press and the revolutionary potential that unleashed, and it fundamentally changed society and ushered in the Reformation and so on, we're going back some 500 years. In the same way, I think social media is now, obviously it's here to stay, and we are at the front end of it, and I think it's important to remember that we are at the front end of this right now, and the changes it could usher in are, we have no idea where it's going to go. But what I'd ask is, to take it back to its absolute root, and this isn't necessarily trying to inoculate ourselves against this, but trying to look at how we can navigate these waters. What are the first principles that you guys would advocate for that would help us navigate this? What do you boil it right down to at its core? If you were talking to your kids or future kids or nephews or anything like that, when they're very young, what would you try and instill in them that would help them navigate this? Because it's here and we're going to have to deal with it, and we're at the front end of it right now.
Yeah, I think if I was talking to my children, there's a lot of issues that would come up, but I think the most relevant lesson here is that the question that always should be on one's mind when we're engaged with trying to understand the world and consuming media is, why do I think this is true? And literally asking yourself that question of like, when I'm telling my friend about this story, oh, I heard X, Y, Z, why do I think this is true? And if you're forced to articulate, oh, well, this person said it, well, why do I think this person is credible? Why do I think they have access to the facts here? Who else is, is anybody disputing it? Just forcing yourself in your own mind to ask, why do I believe this is true? Like, will accelerate your ability to protect yourself from bullshit by like 100%. And, there's a lot more that I think goes into it, but that's a great starting point, and that's how I would orient somebody and try to orient myself in these areas.
A few things. I think for me, the first one is that there is a thing called truth. So there is a material reality out there, and human beings can access the world, and we can know the world. And I think that's been one of the dangerous developments over the last decade or so, this idea that there is no real truth, it's all subjective, or it's all just competing narrative. And so we end up in this kind of game of narrative warfare where it's just whose narrative is going to win out. And so I think the defense of truth, I think, is primary, and I think that should be central to all institutions and all individuals. Also, I believe in human agency. So the sense that human beings can kind of transcend their individual circumstance, their culture, their identity, these things, going back to what we were mentioning in relation to kind of group identity. And I think this kind of sense that the individual, it is something quite unique and should be defended. And I think the third thing is tolerance. So again, I think we do live in a very intolerant time, back to the idea of tribalism, hostility to diversity of opinion. And actually, I think tolerance, to some extent, recognizes one, human agency and truth, but that we all have a piece of the puzzle that makes up the bigger picture. And so to kind of censor in other people is a kind of almost self-negation, because you're basically saying that, other people don't have the capacity to collectively understand or create the world around them. So I think if those three things are central, then I think that you have a much more sense of curiosity and humility about your approach to issues in the world.
Yeah, I think they're all great. I completely agree. I mean, I think if I was speaking to my child, I'd say question everything, and don't let anyone put you in a box because they believe that's where you belong. If someone thinks that you should think a certain way, behave a certain way, and follow a certain crowd, always question that and think, hey, are you telling me what my social reality is, or do I need to investigate that myself? And I think in terms of the philosophical issue that we have, I think we've moved away from the sort of liberalism that you saw gain prevalence around the 18th century, the idea of truth, the idea of reason, the idea of tolerance. We've really moved past that, and I think what I've noticed over the past 2 years is we've kind of reverted to this sort of Rousseauian idea of the collective good, and that people almost need to be forced to see what the collective good is. And sort of, I think that's where we've gotten to a stage where people are talking about my truth, not the truth, and you can't question my truth. But also this idea that people need to be forced to see what the truth is in order for society to be able to function correctly. And I don't think that's right, because what it leads to is things like suppression of free speech. It leads to an intolerance of different views, and it leads to sort of a dogmatic political culture that puts those that perhaps think differently to the mainstream at a disadvantage. And I don't necessarily feel as though it's, you know, majority versus minority, or even minority versus majority, because a lot of the time I don't think media outlets are necessarily looking to reflect what's popular within the general population. I think they're looking to reflect what's popular within a very insular sort of sphere, which can be very damaging. But yeah, I agree with what everyone else said, and I tell them to question everything and not put themselves in a box.
Yeah, so we had an earlier super chat, and then we'll take more audience questions. So Mary Aline asks, would you distinguish between media bias and media error?
I'll go first. I think there can genuinely be errors within reporting. I think, you know, these people are human. It's humans reporting the news. There's always an ability for that. And I think that there are, in this country anyway, ways that media outlets can rectify that. So, for example, particularly with The Sun, they have like a whole page dedicated to corrections and things that they've gotten wrong that they legally have to put out there. But in terms of the bias, I think it's more so to do with deliberately misrepresenting the truth, or deliberately omitting facts that can sort of shape a particular worldview. And I think what's interesting about Fox News, for example, which is what I mentioned before, when the whole Afghanistan withdrawal thing was going on, I was listening to the BBC, I was listening to Sky, and all of the mainstream media outlets, and you were getting a very particular worldview on the withdrawal, that A, it was a bad thing, but B, it's all Trump's fault. And then when I actually watched Fox News to try and get an alternative, I learned things about the withdrawal and Trump's involvement in it that I hadn't necessarily known before. And I think that's sort of where the bias arises, when you deliberately omit facts. But generally, I think media error is fine as long as they own up to it and make it clear, because we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. I think this guy had a question.
Yeah, it was just about Ofcom, the regulator, whether you think that it's working just fine as it is, or whether you think that it should continue to exist but with different parameters, rules governing it, or whether you think it should be done away with.
Yeah, so I think that it serves an okay purpose, but I think it went too far in certain instances. So, for example, during the pandemic, it explicitly said that that media outlets, television media outlets, weren't allowed to report or platform information that went contrary to the government's strategy on the handling of the pandemic. And I think that that was genuinely dangerous. And I think now, 18 months, and we saw that with, even though that was Ofcom, we also saw that with the big tech companies as well. So they did a similar thing, YouTube and Twitter. And 18 months down the line, we're only now being able to talk about things like the lab leak theory, to which is almost too late now to be able to get any evidence from it, because it would just be almost impossible. And so I think that any institution or any organization or company that essentially forms part of the public sphere, effectively saying that you cannot talk about particular things, I think that's a problem. That shouldn't happen. I think that's wrong. There's other things that they do. I think they sanctioned, I can't remember the broadcaster on ITV, I think, who defended the platforming of David Icke. Now you can think David Icke is completely ridiculous, but they didn't even want that particular broadcaster to say that he is allowed to express his view. And very recently, they've published a list of protected characteristics. And that list is very, very, very long, of all of the different identity categories that you have to be very careful when you speak about. And so I do think that Ofcom exists within, as we've mentioned throughout this discussion, a wider culture of hypersensitivity, a wider culture of intolerance. And so it does become a product or reproduce some of those cultural excesses. But it hasn't sanctioned GB News. And it's actually, as far as I'm aware, there's been many complaints, but we've not, as an organization, been sanctioned by Ofcom. So there's clearly some recognition there and openness there to have different views. So there's no doubt problems, but it seems that they're not actually overreaching in other instances where you may think that they would.
I agree, but what do you think? Just I wanted to know why you asked the question.
I think that's quite possible.
I think it should be scaled back. I think I agree.
So I would defend Ofcom just because there are, I think, some rules I think are good. So for example, during the election, there is specific guidance in relation to how you can report an election. So you have to, at certain periods of an election, platform all of the different political parties that are standing. And so perhaps if there wasn't that incentive there, would we still see those kinds of problems? So I do think some form of, some form of kind of minimum expectation or minimum requirement for media outlets can be a positive, but no doubt we have seen it hugely overreach, I think, in the last few years. What do you think of an independent regulator of the television broadcast industry?
Yeah, I don't know the details about the specific situation here, but just in general, how I think about it, it goes back to the idea that, I think you need a strict separation between government and speech. And so, for instance, the way that I think about these things is just that, no, you have private media able to do what they want in their own platforms, and if I disagree, then I can go to a different platform. And so in the US, for instance, we had the fairness doctrine, which has some kind of overlap where it was well, you have to, have all the candidates on and you had to give equal time. And I think that basically runs into the same problem where you can understand why it's being done, and it's often a genuine effort to promote a good discussion of ideas and to promote fairness, as they put it in the name, but it becomes a shoe in the door for control of speech. And I think that ultimately the best thing to do is just you have a strict separation, and then private actors can make decisions that they want to make. And that doesn't automatically lead to some nirvana. So I don't have the view of, well, if you just let like only private media companies and they can do whatever they want, then we're going to get some kind of like blissful end state. I still think you have to, in effect, use moral suasion to encourage the, like, to build the kind of media that you want in your society. But I think that what that does do is it creates a clear dividing line where now you can't forcibly control speech. And that's always my concern with these types of things.
But what do you think about the monopolizing thing that has happened in relation to, so people said, you know, if you don't like Twitter, you can create a new platform, but then they try to create a platform, and then many of the platforms try to push, I think, what was the name of it? Parler out. And so people have tried to do that and create different platforms, but the monopolizing platforms have essentially flattened them. So that is also a danger.
Well, I mean, my view is that, I mean, first of all, it's, you know, so misleading to talk about monopolizing, right? Because it's like there's a bunch of different platforms, and I think that the scary thing is not that there's these kind of concentrated platforms that have grown up, that have arisen. What is worrisome is the ideas that have made us increasingly desirous of silencing controversial opinions and opinions outside the intellectual mainstream. And so that gets reflected in kind of the social media institutions jumping on politically correct bandwagons and kind of suppressing politically unpopular viewpoints. But I don't think you fight that by saying, well, let's have the government use its power to tell the social media companies not to silence those opinions. But so the way I think about it is that the fundamental problem is these poisonous ideas, and then it's kind of it's a secondary issue that then you have these big private actors who, for various I think complicated reasons, act on this often in very misguided ways. I mean, because if you think, like, if you were really trying to shoot yourself in the foot, like, so I'm a big supporter of vaccines, and I think that most people should take them. I think the evidence for their safety is really important. But if you wanted to ask me, like, if I was working for like an anti-vax group and they said, all right, we'll pay you $100 million to come up with the best way to turn people off to the vaccines, I'd say start having YouTube silence critics in the vaccine. Like that that is so counterproductive. And usually the best way to fight bad ideas is like, hey guys, no, have at it. Like put your open your mouth and reveal how uninformed it is. So I think it's very misguided what the social media companies have done, even if you agreed with the positions that they were trying to promote.
By the way, as subscribers to our channel know, YouTube also silences supporters of the vaccine when they think they're critics of the vaccine. We have had that experience once. We are out of time. Mary Aline asked the last minute super chat, is Ofcom like the FCC? I would think it's a bit worse, probably because we don't have the First Amendment here. I don't know if, Don, I'm guessing you don't know Ofcom well enough. Do either of you know? If not, people can let us know in the chat. The FCC, I guess, is sort of the equivalent, but...
I mean, the FCC is basically, it's our controls licenses for the broadcast airwaves, and historically also controls the kind of content that goes over there, though they're very limited in kind of how they can control content. Basically, the main thing that they can do is say, like, you can't use bad words and show, like, certain body parts. But
And on that positive note, we are out of time. So thank you to our three panelists. And there was some talk about public discourse and the public square, and all three of our panelists today are going to be speaking this weekend at Battle of Ideas, which is, it's not a public square because it's a private event, but it's a very good one, and it has been we have been deprived of it for the past 2 years. So, and Don Watkins is speaking on 2 panels, both of which will be live streamed on our channel. One is on fossil fuels, the other is on inequality. So I hope you, if you're in the London area, there's still time, and I think there are still tickets available, and I encourage everybody to attend, and if not, it will be on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, and see you all soon.